The unseen threat. The warm glow of the cafe was a welcome contrast to the cold, bustling streets outside. Naomi Carter sat in a corner booth, a steaming cup of coffee in hand, her dark eyes observing the room's subtle shifts in energy. This particular cafe was one she often frequented when working undercover, blending in with the daily hum of patrons while keeping a low profile. As an experienced FBI agent, she was no stranger to high-stakes situations, but she had learned over the years that her best work happened when she was invisible. Tonight, she was dressed inconspicuously, wearing a soft, gray sweater and dark jeans, her hair styled simply. She looked every bit like any other professional winding down after a long day. But as she sipped her coffee and scanned the room, Naomi's gaze kept returning to the man seated across the cafe. A middle-aged figure with a graying beard and an unassuming demeanor. He was her target, Leonard Marquez, a suspected ringleader in a money laundering operation that had ties to several dangerous international criminal organizations. Her earpiece crackled softly, and her handler, Agent Williams, spoke in her ear. "Naomi, keep an eye on Marquez. He's been spotted with a few high-level contacts recently. We need hard evidence to bring him down." Naomi nodded subtly, replying under her breath. "Understood. I'll get what we need." Her calm demeanor didn't betray the intensity of the mission. After months of careful planning and watching Marquez's every move, she was close to gathering the last piece of evidence needed to dismantle his operation. As Naomi's focus remained on her target, she barely noticed the police officer who had just entered the cafe. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a sharp, almost arrogant expression that she'd seen all too often in her line of work. Officer Mark Thompson was well known among law enforcement circles for his confrontational style. She had crossed paths with him before and found him to be blunt and quick to make assumptions, a trait that made her uneasy. Unbeknownst to Naomi, Thompson's gaze had zeroed in on her. He surveyed her with narrowed eyes, lingering on her dark skin and professional attire with a hint of suspicion. Naomi shifted slightly in her seat, aware of his stare, and hoped he would just move along. She had more important things to focus on than an overzealous cop. But Thompson didn't move on. Instead, he approached her table, his boots making a heavy thud with each step. He stopped directly in front of her, crossing his arms with an air of authority. "Miss, may I ask what you're doing here?" His tone was cold, each word punctuated with a note of superiority. Naomi glanced up at him, keeping her expression neutral. "I'm just having coffee," she replied, her tone measured and calm. She hoped this would be the end of the interaction, but something told her it wouldn't be that easy. Thompson's eyes scanned her, his gaze landing on the sleek bag resting on the table beside her. "Mind if I see some ID?" he demanded, a hint of challenge in his voice. Naomi's jaw clenched ever so slightly, but she remained composed. She didn't want to attract attention or risk blowing her cover. "Is there a reason you're asking for my ID, officer?" she replied, keeping her tone polite yet firm. Thompson's lips curved into a faint smirk, his eyes glinting with a patronizing edge. "We've had some reports about suspicious behavior in this area. Just making sure everything is in order." Naomi could feel the weight of his assumptions, the way he'd taken one look at her and decided she didn't belong. Her mind raced as she weighed her options. She knew she hadn't done anything to warrant suspicion, but refusing could escalate the situation further, potentially jeopardizing the entire operation. Reluctantly, she reached into her bag, retrieving her wallet and handing over her ID. Thompson glanced at the card, barely registering her name, Naomi Carter, before fixing his eyes back on her. His gaze was hard, challenging. "So, Miss Carter, what exactly brings you here? You seem out of place." Naomi took a steadying breath, her frustration simmering beneath her calm exterior. She was used to people underestimating her, to assumptions being made because of her appearance, but it never got easier. "Just grabbing a coffee," she repeated, her voice steady. "Is that a crime?" The officer's smirk deepened, as if he found her defiance amusing. "We'll see about that," he muttered. Then, with a motion of his hand, he gestured to two additional officers who had just entered the cafe, both of whom approached with expressions of uncertainty. Naomi noticed that one of them, a younger officer named Richards, looked uncomfortable, casting glances between Thompson and herself. "Is this really necessary, Officer Thompson?" Naomi asked, unable to keep the edge out of her voice. She could feel the eyes of other patrons on her, the growing discomfort in the room as people whispered and exchanged glances. Her target, Marquez, was now fully aware of the unfolding scene, a hint of amusement playing on his lips as he observed from across the cafe. Thompson's expression hardened, his authority solidifying. "Miss Carter, you're going to need to come with us for further questioning," he declared, loud enough for the entire cafe to hear. Naomi's heart pounded, a mixture of frustration and disbelief washing over her. She had done everything by the book, had planned this operation meticulously to avoid exactly this kind of exposure. But here she was, being dragged into an unnecessary confrontation because of one man's prejudice. She rose from her seat, her hands clenched at her sides as she met Thompson's gaze. She kept her composure, refusing to let him see the anger simmering beneath her calm exterior. As she stepped forward, she felt the weight of judgmental stares from the patrons around her, their expressions a mixture of curiosity, discomfort, and, in some cases, silent disapproval. Out of the corner of her eye, Naomi noticed Marquez watching the entire scene unfold. His lips curled into a smirk, clearly entertained by her predicament. Her stomach churned at the thought that he might suspect something now, that her cover might be blown because of Thompson's interference. Outside, the cool evening air hit her skin, a stark contrast to the heated tension within. Thompson pulled out a pair of handcuffs, reaching for her wrists with a smug satisfaction that made her skin crawl. She felt the cold metal bite into her wrists, a sharp reminder of her current powerlessness. As she was led toward the waiting police cruiser, Naomi glanced over her shoulder, locking eyes with Officer Richards. Unlike Thompson, his expression wasn't one of satisfaction or triumph. Instead, there was something hesitant, even regretful, in his gaze. It was a small consolation, a hint that not everyone was complicit in this charade of authority. Just as Thompson was about to guide her into the back seat of the cruiser, she spoke up, her voice firm and unyielding. "You have no idea who you're dealing with, officer." Thompson paused, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face before it hardened again. "We'll see about that," he sneered, shoving her into the car. As the door slammed shut behind her, Naomi felt a surge of resolve wash over her. She might be momentarily confined, but she was far from defeated. She had spent years navigating high-stakes situations, enduring challenges that had tested every ounce of her strength. This was just another obstacle, a particularly infuriating one, but one she was prepared to overcome. The mission was at risk, yes, but as Naomi sat in the back seat of the cruiser, her mind began to formulate a plan. She knew the system inside out, knew the law and her rights better than anyone. And most of all, she knew that she had the resources and resilience to turn this situation around. Thompson's arrogance had blinded him to the truth, but he was about to learn a lesson he would never forget. The power of resilience. The police cruiser rolled down the street, the flashing lights casting an intermittent glow through the rear window. Naomi sat in the back, her wrists still restrained by the cold metal cuffs, feeling a mix of frustration and determination building within her. As the vehicle made its way toward the precinct, she maintained her composure, using every ounce of her training to keep her mind focused. She could feel the weight of the cuffs biting into her wrists, but she refused to let this physical discomfort cloud her thoughts. Officer Thompson was in the driver's seat, his jaw set with a smug satisfaction that made Naomi's frustration flare. He occasionally glanced at her in the rearview mirror, as if expecting to see some sign of distress. But Naomi's face remained a mask of calm defiance. She wasn't about to give him the satisfaction of seeing her unsettled. Beside him, Officer Richards sat in silence, his gaze fixed out the window, his discomfort palpable. Naomi noticed the subtle tension in his shoulders, the way he shifted in his seat, as though the weight of Thompson's decision sat heavily on him. She could tell he was torn, and that hesitation could be useful. If she played this right, she might have a way to turn this situation around without blowing her cover. As they approached the precinct, Thompson's voice broke the silence. "You know," he began, his tone dripping with condescension, "I don't know what you thought you were doing in that cafe, but your kind doesn't belong in places like that." His eyes met hers in the rearview mirror, his smirk widening at what he likely assumed was a look of submission. Naomi took a slow, steady breath, her eyes locked onto his in the mirror. "My kind," she echoed, her tone steady but laced with steel. "And what kind is that, Officer Thompson?" Thompson chuckled, the sound lacking any warmth. "You know exactly what I mean. Acting like you're something special, thinking you're above the rules. People like you don't get to pretend you belong in places where real money is spent." Richards shifted uncomfortably, and Naomi noticed his fingers tapping anxiously against his thigh. He glanced at Thompson, as if debating whether to say something, but ultimately stayed silent. Naomi could see the internal conflict etched on his face, the discomfort at Thompson's blatant prejudice. It was clear that Richards wasn't entirely on board with how this was playing out. "You really don't know anything about me," Naomi said, her voice calm and unwavering. "But trust me, you're going to regret treating me like this." Thompson scoffed, dismissing her words with a shake of his head. "I doubt that," he sneered, turning his attention back to the road. Moments later, they pulled up to the precinct. Thompson parked the car and stepped out, opening the back door and roughly pulling Naomi out. He led her into the building, his grip on her arm firm and unyielding. She could feel the eyes of the other officers in the station on her as they walked through, some curious, others surprised. It wasn't every day that a well-dressed woman was marched into their station in cuffs. As they passed by a group of officers, Naomi heard whispers ripple through the room. "Who's she? Why's she in cuffs? Looks like she doesn't belong here." She kept her head held high, refusing to let the murmurs affect her. Thompson guided her to an empty holding cell, releasing her wrists from the cuffs before shoving her inside. The metal bars clanged shut with a resounding finality, and Naomi was left standing alone in the small, sterile cell. Thompson lingered outside the cell, arms crossed, a smirk still playing on his lips. "You'll stay here until I decide what to do with you," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. Naomi met his gaze, her face unreadable. "Enjoy this while you can, Officer Thompson," she replied coolly, "because you're not going to be enjoying it for long." With that, she turned her back on him, walking to the far side of the cell and sitting down on the bench. She closed her eyes, taking a moment to steady herself, to focus on her breathing and clear her mind. She needed to stay calm, to keep her emotions in check. Losing her temper now would only give Thompson more satisfaction. Just as she settled into a rhythm, she heard footsteps approaching. She opened her eyes to see Officer Richards standing outside the cell, his expression conflicted. He glanced over his shoulder to make sure they were alone before leaning in closer. I just wanted to say, I'm sorry about all this," he murmured, his voice low. "Thompson can be difficult." Naomi looked up at him, her expression softening slightly. "Then why don't you do something about it?" she asked, her tone gentle but firm. Richard sighed, running a hand over his face. "It's not that simple. Thompson's got a lot of influence around here. He's been on the force for years. Going against him, it's risky." Naomi held his gaze, sensing the hesitation in his eyes. "You know this isn't right, Richards," she said quietly. "You don't have to be a part of it." Richards shifted, glancing away. "Look, I don't agree with how he's treating you, but I can't just go against him. It's complicated." Naomi nodded slowly, understanding the constraints he felt. She had seen this kind of reluctance before, the fear of standing up against someone in power, even when it was the right thing to do. But she also saw a glimmer of something in Richards, a hint of integrity, of someone who knew this was wrong, and was struggling with the choice to intervene. "You're better than this, Richards," she said softly. "You don't have to compromise who you are just because of him." Richards looked at her, his expression pained. For a brief moment, she thought she saw a spark of resolve in his eyes, but then he shook his head, looking defeated. I'll see what I can do," he mumbled, before turning and walking away, leaving Naomi alone once more. As the minutes ticked by, Naomi's mind raced. She replayed the events of the evening, analyzing every detail, every choice she'd made, every reaction from Marquez. She worried about the mission, about what Marquez might be thinking after witnessing the scene in the cafe. Would he suspect her? Would he think she was a cop? If he did, months of undercover work could be unraveled by Thompson's reckless actions. Just as she was about to lose herself in these thoughts, her earpiece crackled to life. She adjusted her hair subtly, ensuring the tiny device remained concealed. "Naomi, it's Williams," her handler's voice came through, quiet and tense. "We know what's happening. We're working on getting you out of there." Naomi felt a surge of relief wash over her. "Good to know," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Mark sought everything. I'm worried he's onto me." "We're covering it on our end," Williams assured her. "Hang tight, and don't worry about Thompson. We'll take care of him." Naomi closed her eyes, feeling a wave of gratitude toward her team. She knew they had her back, and that knowledge strengthened her resolve. This wasn't over. She would find a way to salvage the mission, no matter what it took. About an hour later, Thompson returned, his smug grin still firmly in place. "Guess what, Miss Carter," he sneered. "Looks like you're going to be staying here a little longer." Naomi looked up at him, her calm demeanor unwavering. "Is that so?" she replied, her voice laced with quiet confidence. "Yes," he replied, clearly enjoying himself. "You're going to be here until you learn some respect." Naomi smiled, a knowing look in her eyes. "We'll see about that, Officer Thompson." As he turned to leave, Naomi felt a sense of calm settle over her. She knew that her team was out there, working to secure her release, and when she was free, she would make sure that Officer Thompson regretted every single second of this ordeal. With renewed determination, she leaned back against the cold metal bench, waiting. The tables would turn soon, and when they did, justice would finally be served. A deeper resolve. Naomi sat on the hard, metal bench in the small holding cell, her fingers tracing the faint grooves etched into the steel. The stark overhead lights cast sharp shadows on the walls, intensifying the cold, impersonal feel of the precinct. Despite her calm outward demeanor, her mind was racing. She was acutely aware of the weight of her situation, but years of training had conditioned her to remain steady under pressure. She closed her eyes, visualizing every step of the operation she'd spent months building, trying to assure herself that it wasn't lost. Her target, Leonard Marquez, had likely witnessed the entire debacle of the cafe. His smirk still lingered in her mind, a silent taunt from across the room, mocking her compromised position. If Marquez had even the slightest suspicion that she was law enforcement, he'd disappear into the criminal underworld again, out of reach, leaving her months of work in ruins. Just as these thoughts settled into her mind, footsteps echoed down the corridor. Naomi opened her eyes, expecting to see Officer Thompson's smug face once again. Instead, it was Officer Richards. He looked hesitant, standing just outside the cell, one hand resting on his belt, and the other clutching a clipboard. "Agent Carter," he said quietly, glancing down the hall as if ensuring no one else was around. I wanted to check on you." Naomi regarded him for a moment, noting the slight shame in his eyes. He was clearly conflicted, caught between his sense of duty and loyalty to his partner. She sensed that he wasn't inherently prejudiced or corrupt like Thompson, but was instead trapped in the web of his partner's arrogance and authority. "You don't have to call me Agent here, Officer Richards," she replied, her tone measured but kind. "I'm just a citizen in your holding cell, remember?" He shifted uncomfortably, looking down at the clipboard as if it could offer him an escape. "Look, I didn't know he'd take it this far," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "Thompson has a reputation for being. Let's just say he's not the most open-minded person on the force. But I didn't think he'd do this." Naomi crossed her arms, her gaze piercing. "And yet here I am, sitting in a cell because your partner couldn't handle seeing someone he deemed out of place in a cafe." Richard swallowed, visibly affected by her words. "I know it's wrong," he admitted, shame flickering across his face. "But you have to understand, Thompson's been here for years. He has connections. If I push back against him, it could end my career before it even starts." Naomi softened her stance, understanding the position Richards was in. She had encountered people like him before, decent individuals shackled by the authority of someone with a more assertive, domineering personality. But she also knew that if he didn't stand up now, he would only become more complicit in Thompson's prejudiced actions. "Listen, Richards," she said, her tone firm but gentle. "I get that you're in a tough spot, but you have a choice here. You can either be the person who stands by and lets this happen, or you can be the person who decides to make a change, even if it's difficult." He looked at her, a mixture of fear and resolve in his eyes. Naomi could see the internal struggle playing out on his face, and she hoped her words would tip the scales toward integrity. Finally, he nodded, though he still looked uncertain. I'll see what I can do," he whispered before quickly walking away, glancing over his shoulder as if fearful someone might overhear. Left alone once more, Naomi let out a slow breath. She knew that convincing Richards to intervene would only be part of the solution. She needed to get out of this cell and back to her mission. Marquez's network extended far beyond their local precinct, and every minute she was detained increased the risk of compromising the entire operation. After what felt like an eternity, Thompson returned, his smirk firmly in place. He swaggered up to the cell, keys jingling in his hand, the arrogance radiating off him in waves. Well, he said, leaning against the bars with an air of superiority. "Still think you're above the rules, Miss Carter? Maybe a little more time here will teach you some respect." Naomi met his gaze calmly, refusing to give him any satisfaction. "Is that what this is about? Teaching me respect? Or is it about your inability to handle seeing a black woman in a place you don't think she belongs?" Thompson's smirk faltered, but he quickly recovered, rolling his eyes dismissively. "You're just playing the victim. You think people owe you something just because you have a fancy outfit and a chip on your shoulder." Naomi felt a wave of anger rise within her, but she suppressed it, reminding herself that her anger would only fuel his arrogance. Instead, she leaned back against the wall, her calm expression ever wavering. "You can believe whatever you want, Officer Thompson," she replied evenly. "But the truth has a way of catching up with people like you, and when it does, it won't be me sitting behind bars." Thompson's jaw tightened, and for a moment, she thought she saw a flash of insecurity in his eyes. But he quickly masked it, straightening up and adjusting his belt. "Enjoy your stay," he sneered before walking away, his footsteps echoing down the corridor. Left alone once more, Naomi allowed herself a moment of vulnerability. She closed her eyes, inhaling deeply, willing herself to stay strong. She knew she couldn't let this setback define her. She had come too far, endured too much, to let one arrogant cop derail everything she'd worked for. Just then, her earpiece crackled faintly, and she adjusted her hair subtly to listen. "Naomi, it's Williams," her handler's voice came through, calm but firm. "We got a plan to get you out. Richards contacted us. Seems like he's on your side after all. We're working with him to create a diversion so you can walk out of there." Naomi's heart swelled with relief and gratitude. "Thank you, Williams," she whispered, keeping her voice low. "I'm ready whenever you are." "Stay sharp," Williams replied. "This is going to happen fast, so be prepared to move." Naomi opened her eyes, her senses sharpening as she prepared for what was to come. She could feel her pulse quicken, the adrenaline coursing through her veins as she awaited her chance at freedom. About 10 minutes later, she heard a commotion in the hallway. A raised voice, the sound of paper scattering, and the distant thud of something heavy falling to the ground. A few moments later, Richards appeared outside her cell, keys in hand, his expression tense but resolute. "This is your chance," he whispered urgently, unlocking the door. "Thompson's been called into an emergency briefing. You need to get out now." Naomi stepped out of the cell, her movements swift and purposeful. She nodded to Richards, offering him a grateful look. "Thank you," she said quietly, her tone filled with sincerity. He nodded, glancing down the hallway nervously. "Just be careful. If Thompson finds out, it'll be both our jobs." Naomi placed a reassuring hand on his arm. "I'll handle it. And Richards, you did the right thing." With that, she moved swiftly down the hallway, her steps silent as she navigated through the precinct. She kept her head down, her movements calculated, slipping past officers who were too engrossed in the manufactured chaos to notice her. The exit was just ahead, the cool night air visible through the glass doors, beckoning her toward freedom. She pushed through the doors, inhaling deeply as she stepped outside. The crisp air filled her lungs, invigorating her senses. For a brief moment, she allowed herself to relish the feeling of liberation, but she knew her work wasn't over yet. Naomi took out her phone, dialing Williams. "I'm out," she said quietly. "Where's Marquez?" "Back at the cafe," Williams replied. "We managed to keep him there long enough. He hasn't left yet, but we're running out of time." "Good," Naomi replied, her voice filled with steely determination. "I'm heading there now." With a newfound sense of resolve, Naomi moved swiftly down the street, her steps purposeful and unyielding. She had overcome the unexpected challenge thrown her way, and now it was time to finish what she'd started. Marquez wouldn't know what hit him. And as for Thompson, Naomi knew that his actions tonight wouldn't go unanswered. She would make sure that justice was served, not only for herself, but for everyone who had ever been subjected to the kind of prejudice he represented. This was about more than just one mission. It was about standing up against a system that allowed people like Thompson to abuse their power unchecked. Naomi Carter was ready, and nothing would stand in her way. The chase begins. The night air was crisp and charged with tension as Naomi made her way through the dimly lit streets, her mind sharp and focused. Her liberation from the precinct had ignited a fire within her, fueling her drive to finish what she'd started. The events of the evening, the humiliation, the unfair treatment were lodged in her mind like splinters, painful but ultimately strengthening her resolve. She wasn't just a secret agent on a mission. She was a woman reclaiming her dignity in the face of injustice. William's voice crackled in her earpiece, guiding her toward her next move. "Naomi, Marquez is still at the cafe. We've kept him engaged with a couple of our agents, but he's getting restless. You need to get there before he decides to bolt." "Understood," Naomi replied, her voice calm but steely. She could practically see Marquez in her mind's eye, the smug look that had crossed his face as Thompson dragged her out of the cafe. He had thought she was just another innocent bystander, a woman inconvenienced by a racist cop. Little did he know she was the very agent assigned to bring him down. As she made her way back to the cafe, Naomi replayed her encounter with Thompson in her mind. His arrogance, his narrow-mindedness, it wasn't just frustrating. It was a reminder of the deep-rooted prejudice that still tainted the justice system. And while her mission was to take down Marquez, she knew she couldn't let Thompson walk away without repercussions. But that would come later. For now, she had a job to do. Within minutes, she approached the cafe, her pace slowing as she neared the entrance. The cafe was dimly lit, the quiet hum of patrons and low jazz music spilling out into the street. Naomi took a deep breath, steeling herself. She knew that Marquez was cunning, a master manipulator who thrived in chaos. She needed to be cautious, but she also couldn't afford to let him slip through her fingers. As she stepped inside, the atmosphere in the cafe seemed to shift. Patrons continued with their meals, oblivious to the quiet tension building around them. but Naomi's sharp gaze cut through the room, seeking out her target. She spotted him at the far end, seated in a plush leather booth, sipping a glass of whiskey. His posture was relaxed, but Naomi could see the faint tension in his jawline, the subtle unease in his gaze as he glanced around the room. Her earpiece buzzed. "Naomi, we've got eyes on him," Williams informed her. "He's been on edge since you left. Proceed carefully, but don't let him out of your sight." "Copy that," Naomi whispered, making her way to a table near Marquez, where she could observe him without drawing too much attention. She picked up a menu, pretending to read it as she watched him out of the corner of her eye. She could feel his gaze occasionally drifting toward her, as if he sensed something was amiss but couldn't quite place it. Naomi kept her movements subtle, her demeanor calm, blending into the background. She'd honed this skill over years in the field, the art of being invisible even when she was hiding in plain sight. After a few tense minutes, Marquez's phone buzzed, and she noticed him tense slightly as he checked the screen. His fingers tapped out a quick message before he tucked the phone back into his pocket. Naomi's instincts flared. Something was up. "Williams, he just sent a message," she whispered into her earpiece. "See if we can intercept it." "On it," Williams replied, his tone focused. "We'll have a team working on it now." Naomi's heart pounded as she watched Marquez drain his glass, his eyes scanning the room once more before he stood up. She knew she had to follow him without arousing suspicion. Keeping her movements smooth and casual, she slid out of her seat, leaving a bill on the table before heading toward the door. Once outside, she spotted Marquez turning the corner, his pace brisk but composed. She followed him at a distance, keeping to the shadows, her footsteps soundless against the pavement. The city lights cast long shadows across the streets, and the distant sound of traffic filled the silence. She was careful to maintain a respectable distance, keeping Marquez in her line of sight without revealing her presence. The chase took them through several narrow alleyways, each darker and more secluded than the last. Marquez seemed to be heading somewhere with a purpose, and Naomi knew he was likely trying to meet someone in his network. She couldn't afford to lose him now. She quickened her pace, careful to stay hidden but close enough to react if he made any sudden moves. Her earpiece crackled to life. "Naomi, we've decrypted part of the message he sent." It was to an unknown number. "Coordinates for a location on the outskirts of the city," Williams informed her. "He's likely headed there to rendezvous with someone. You need to intercept him before he reaches that location." "Understood," Naomi replied, her mind racing as she recalculated her approach. She picked up her pace, closing the gap between herself and Marquez, her heart pounding with the thrill of the pursuit. This was what she was trained for: quick decisions, high-stakes action, the art of blending stealth with precision. As Marquez turned down a particularly isolated alley, Naomi saw her chance. She moved quickly, stepping into his path with a quiet but commanding presence. He stopped abruptly, his eyes widening as he realized who was standing before him. "Marquez," she greeted him, her voice calm yet laced with authority. "Going somewhere?" He smirked, quickly regaining his composure. "Well, if it isn't the mystery woman from the café, shouldn't you be at the precinct, Miss Carter?" Naomi crossed her arms, her gaze unyielding. "I think we both know that's not where I belong," she replied. "But I can assure you, you're exactly where you belong. So why don't we skip the formalities, and you tell me who you're meeting?" Marquez chuckled, his expression one of bemusement. "Oh, you're good, I'll give you that. But you're in over your head. You think you can just stroll in here, play the hero, and get what you want." Naomi met his gaze with a steady calm. "It's not about what I want, Marquez. It's about justice, and you've been evading it for far too long." Marquez's smirk faded, replaced by a flash of irritation. He took a step back, his hand reaching toward his pocket. Naomi's instincts kicked in, and in a swift motion, she stepped forward, grabbing his wrist before he could make a move. "Let's not make this harder than it has to be," she said, her tone sharp. He sneered, struggling against her grip. You really think you're in control here? I have connections, people who would burn down this city for me. Naomi tightened her hold, leaning in closer, her voice a low whisper. You can have all the connections in the world, Marquez, but they won't save you from the truth. You're done running. Marquez's bravado faltered, his eyes narrowing as he realized the weight of her words. For the first time, he seemed genuinely unsettled, his defiance tempered by a sliver of fear. Naomi took advantage of his hesitation, swiftly cuffing his wrists. This is over, she said firmly, stepping back to ensure he was fully restrained. Your network, your power, it all ends here. As she led him out of the alley, her earpiece buzzed again. Naomi, we've got backup on the way. They'll meet you at the rendezvous point. Copy that, she replied, keeping her focus on Marquez, who walked beside her in silence, his shoulders slumped in defeat. His aura of arrogance had dissipated, replaced by the quiet resignation of a man who knew he had finally been cornered. As they made their way through the city streets, Naomi felt a surge of satisfaction. She had overcome every obstacle thrown her way tonight. The prejudice of Officer Thompson, the threat of her mission unraveling, the personal attacks on her dignity. Through it all, she had emerged victorious, her resolve unshaken. When they arrived at the rendezvous point, her fellow agents were waiting, their expressions ones of pride and respect. Williams approached her, a slight smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Good work, Agent Carter, he said, nodding approvingly. We'll take it from here. Naomi handed Marquez over, watching as her colleagues secured him in the back of a van. She took a deep breath, the weight of the night's events settling over her. But despite the challenges, she felt stronger than ever. As she turned to leave, she noticed Officer Richards standing nearby, a look of admiration in his eyes. He nodded at her, an unspoken acknowledgement of her strength and integrity. She returned the nod, grateful for his small but significant role in helping her escape the precinct. Naomi walked away from the scene, her heart steady, her mind clear. She knew that her fight wasn't over. She still had Thompson to deal with, and she intended to ensure he faced consequences for his actions. But tonight, she had won a significant battle, one that proved she could withstand anything thrown her way. With each step, she carried a sense of victory, a quiet yet unbreakable resilience. She had shown everyone, Thompson, Marquez, the truth unveiled. Naomi's satisfaction from Marquez's arrest was short-lived. Although she had achieved a major victory by apprehending one of the key players in a criminal network, she knew that her personal battle with Officer Thompson was far from over. The indignity and unfair treatment she'd suffered at his hands still gnawed at her. She couldn't just let him walk away unscathed, not after his abuse of power and blatant display of prejudice. As she returned to the FBI field office later that night, Naomi's mind raced with plans. She was going to take this matter to the higher-ups. Thompson's actions needed to be reviewed, not only for her sake, but for anyone else who might fall victim to his biases in the future. She had spent her career fighting for justice, and now it was time to ensure that justice was upheld within her own ranks. Agent Carter, Williams greeted her as she entered, his face reflecting a mix of pride and concern. Marquez is secure, and the intel he had on him is going to be invaluable. Excellent work tonight. But I heard about the incident with Officer Thompson. You okay? Naomi nodded, though the frustration was evident in her expression. Thank you, Williams. And yes, I'm okay. But Thompson's behavior was unacceptable. He detained me without cause, all because of his own assumptions. I can't let this slide. Not for me, and not for anyone else who might face the same treatment. Williams nodded thoughtfully, leaning back in his chair. I figured you'd want to take action. The Bureau will back you up, Naomi. You've proven yourself time and again. I'll make sure your report on this goes up the chain of command. Naomi's heart lifted slightly at his words, grateful to have an ally in this fight. But she knew this was just the beginning. She had to prepare a formal complaint against Thompson, documenting every detail of the night. The Bureau's Internal Affairs Department would review the case, but she had to make sure the evidence was thorough and irrefutable. Later that night, after drafting her report, Naomi sat in her dimly lit apartment, reviewing every interaction with Thompson in her mind. She felt a tinge of exhaustion, but was determined to see this through. She wouldn't let one man's prejudice undermine everything she'd worked for. As she sipped her tea, her phone buzzed with a message from an unexpected contact. Officer Richards. Richards. Hey, Agent Carter. I wanted to check in and say I'm sorry for what happened earlier. If there's anything I can do, let me know. Naomi stared at the message for a moment, surprised but touched by his willingness to reach out. She quickly typed a response. Naomi, thank you, Officer Richards. I appreciate your concern. If you're serious, there might be something you can do. I'm filing a report on Thompson's misconduct. Your statement as a witness would help. Richards, absolutely. I've had my doubts about Thompson for a while. This was the final straw for me. I'll back you up. A sense of relief washed over Naomi. Having Richard's support would strengthen her case significantly. She felt a renewed sense of purpose, knowing that there were allies even within a flawed system. The following day, Naomi met with her Bureau's Internal Affairs team to present her case. They listened attentively as she recounted every detail of her encounter with Thompson. Her voice was calm, but her resolve was palpable. She didn't flinch or hesitate, making it clear that she wouldn't back down until justice was served. At the end of her presentation, she introduced Officer Richards as a witness. He corroborated her story, detailing Thompson's hostility and unwarranted suspicion. His testimony added weight to her claims, and the investigators exchanged meaningful glances as they took notes. Thank you, Agent Carter. Officer Richards, one of the investigators said, nodding thoughtfully. This case is troubling, to say the least. We'll conduct a thorough investigation and make sure Officer Thompson is held accountable for his actions. As Naomi left the meeting room, Richards fell into step beside her. He seemed visibly relieved to have spoken up, as if a burden had been lifted from his shoulders. Thank you for backing me up, Richards, she said sincerely. It takes courage to stand up against someone you've worked with for years. Richards shrugged, though a faint smile crossed his face. Honestly, it's overdue. Thompson's attitude has been an issue for a while. It's about time someone called him out. I'm glad it was you. Naomi smiled, feeling a sense of camaraderie. Despite everything, she felt hopeful. This wasn't just a victory for her. It was a step toward creating a fairer, more accountable system. Over the next few days, Naomi stayed focused on her work, keeping herself busy with other cases while the investigation proceeded. She still felt the weight of her experience with Thompson, but she reminded herself that change took time and perseverance. She was determined to stay patient. On the fifth day after the incident, Williams approached her desk with a document in hand and an approving smile on his face. Naomi, Internal Affairs, just wrapped up their investigation. They found Thompson guilty of misconduct and abuse of power. He's been suspended pending further disciplinary action. Naomi felt a surge of relief. Justice in some form had been served. She knew this was just one small victory in a larger fight, but it was a reminder that persistence and resilience could yield results. I knew you'd get this done, Williams added, his eyes gleaming with pride. You stood up not just for yourself, but for everyone who deserves fair treatment. That's what makes you one of the best. Naomi nodded, her heart swelling with a sense of accomplishment. This wasn't the end of her journey, but it was a milestone, a validation of her fight for justice. That evening, Naomi decided to treat herself to a quiet night out. She chose a small, cozy cafe in the city, the kind of place where she could lose herself in a book and savor the moment. As she sat sipping her coffee, she noticed Richards entering the cafe. He spotted her, gave a tentative wave, and approached her table. Mind if I join you? He asked, gesturing to the empty seat across from her. Of course, Naomi replied, smiling warmly. They spent the evening talking about everything from their work to the challenges of navigating a system often resistant to change. Richards expressed his own frustrations with the department's culture, admitting that Thompson's actions had been a wake-up call for him. "Seeing what happened with you made me realize that staying silent isn't an option," he confessed. "If I want things to be better, I have to start by holding people accountable, even if it's uncomfortable." Naomi nodded, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. "Change always begins with the courage to speak up," she said. "It's not easy, but it's necessary. I think more people are beginning to understand that." As they continued talking, Naomi felt a glimmer of hope. The experience with Thompson had been painful, but it had also sparked something meaningful. She had gained an ally in Richards and had inspired a shift, however small, within the department. By the time she left the cafe, Naomi felt lighter, her spirits lifted by the knowledge that her fight had made a difference. She walked through the city streets, her head held high, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. As she returned to her apartment, Naomi checked her phone to see a message from Williams. "Williams, proud of you, Naomi. You've set a precedent. Keep fighting the good fight." Naomi's resolve solidified. She knew that her work was far from over, but she was ready for it. The encounter with Thompson, the support from Richards, the victory over Marquez, all of it had prepared her for what lay ahead. She would continue to stand up for justice, for those who couldn't fight for themselves, and for the kind of world she believed in. With a sense of renewed purpose, Naomi prepared for the battles yet to come, knowing that every step she took brought her closer to a future defined by resilience, integrity, and justice, a legacy of change. The events with Officer Thompson had deeply impacted Naomi. Though her role as an undercover FBI agent meant facing challenges, the encounter had struck a chord. It served as a stark reminder that even as an agent of the law, she wasn't immune to prejudice and bias. But instead of feeling disheartened, Naomi felt a new surge of determination to turn her experience into a catalyst for meaningful change. Days after Thompson's suspension, Naomi found herself standing outside the FBI headquarters, taking in the brisk morning air. Today was important. She'd been invited to speak with her department's leadership about her recent experience. This was an opportunity to share her story and advocate for measures that could help prevent such incidents in the future. She was no longer just fighting for herself. She was fighting for everyone who deserved fair and just treatment, regardless of background. Inside the conference room, the atmosphere was tense but respectful. Naomi glanced around the table at the senior officials, her handler Williams, and a few colleagues who had supported her through the ordeal. She could feel their eyes on her, waiting to hear her perspective. With a steady breath, she began. "Thank you all for giving me this opportunity to speak today. As you know, my recent experience with Officer Thompson was more than just a misunderstanding. It was an example of how bias can lead to abuse of power. What happened to me isn't unique. It's something people of color, women, and other marginalized groups face every day. But what makes it worse is that it came from within our own justice system." Her words echoed through the room, and she could see nods of agreement from a few faces around the table. The gravity of her statement wasn't lost on them. "I'm grateful for the Bureau's support in handling this situation, and for Officer Richards, who had the courage to stand by me. But we must acknowledge that these incidents can't be brushed aside as isolated. They are symptomatic of a larger issue, one that requires us to hold ourselves to a higher standard." One of the senior officials, a tall man with graying hair and a thoughtful expression, leaned forward. "Agent Carter, we recognize the challenges you faced and the dignity with which you handled yourself. In light of your experience, do you have specific recommendations for how we can improve our procedures?" Naomi nodded, grateful for the opportunity. She had spent nights drafting her thoughts, and now she spoke from both her heart and her experiences. "First, I believe we need more rigorous training on cultural competency and bias within law enforcement and the Bureau. It's not enough to simply be aware of the laws. We must understand the diverse communities we serve and ensure we're treating everyone with respect and fairness. This training should be mandatory and regularly reinforced. She paused, ensuring her words were resonating before continuing. Second, I'd recommend a stronger accountability system for officers like Thompson. Misconduct, especially when rooted in bias, should be met with decisive action. We need to create a culture where officers and agents feel safe reporting inappropriate behavior, knowing they'll be supported rather than silenced. A murmur of agreement spread across the room. Naomi felt encouraged, emboldened by their reactions. And lastly, she continued, her voice unwavering, we need to foster mentorship and allyship within our ranks. Officers and agents should feel empowered to support each other, just as Officer Richards did for me. If we can build a community of accountability and mutual respect, we will be far more effective in serving the public. Williams nodded, a proud smile flickering across his face. Thank you, Agent Carter. Your insights are invaluable. I think I speak for everyone when I say that your resilience and commitment to justice have made a lasting impact. As the meeting concluded, Naomi felt a profound sense of accomplishment. It was just the beginning, but she had taken a critical first step toward creating a more inclusive and just environment. Over the following weeks, Naomi noticed subtle yet meaningful changes within her department. New initiatives were introduced, with officers and agents participating in workshops on cultural awareness and implicit bias. A mentorship program was established, pairing newer recruits with seasoned agents who could provide guidance and support. Naomi herself was asked to mentor a young recruit, an eager woman of color who looked up to her as a role model. One evening, after a long day at work, Naomi received an unexpected message from Richards. Richards, hey, Agent Carter. Just wanted to say thank you. Things feel different around here. Better. People are talking, learning. I've even signed up to lead a bias training workshop next month. None of this would have happened if you hadn't stood up. Proud to have worked with you on this. A warm smile spread across Naomi's face. It was messages like these that reassured her she had made a difference. The struggle had been challenging, but seeing the changes ripple through her department made it all worthwhile. Months passed, and Naomi continued to thrive in her role, balancing her undercover work with her new responsibilities as a mentor and advocate. Her experience with Thompson, once a painful memory, had transformed into a source of strength and purpose. One afternoon, she found herself in that same cafe where she'd first been confronted by Thompson. She sat near the window, sipping her coffee, reflecting on how much had changed since that night. The cafe bustled with patrons, but this time, she felt no judgmental stares or lingering suspicion, only the peaceful hum of a city at ease. As she watched people walk by, Naomi felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. She had come so far, not only in her career but in her personal journey as well. She had faced adversity, fought against prejudice, and emerged stronger and more determined. Her thoughts were interrupted by a familiar voice. She looked up to see Williams, standing by her table with a warm smile. "Mind if I join you?" he asked, holding his coffee cup. "Of course, Williams," she replied, gesturing to the seat across from her. As they chatted, Williams reflected on how Naomi's case had inspired reforms within the Bureau. "You know, Naomi, I've seen a lot of agents come and go, but very few leave a legacy. You've done more than just complete missions. You've set a standard. People are talking, they're listening, and they're learning. That's rare, and it's powerful." Naomi felt a surge of pride, humbled by his words. "Thank you, Williams. I just wanted to make a difference, even if it was a small one. It's people like you, Richards, and others who believed in me that made it possible." Williams raised his cup in a toast to resilience, justice, and making a difference. They clinked their coffee cups, a small but significant gesture of victory. Naomi felt an unshakable resolve settle within her. She knew there would always be challenges and injustices to confront, but she was ready. Her journey was far from over, and she was determined to continue fighting for a world where fairness, respect, and dignity prevailed. As she left the cafe that evening, Naomi walked with a newfound sense of purpose. She was no longer just an agent on a mission. She was a beacon of change, a champion for justice, and a testament to the power of resilience. And as she disappeared into the evening crowd, Naomi knew she had left an indelible mark, not only on her department but on the lives of countless others who would follow in her footsteps.